and what is prompting it here at the moment here in Europe and also in the United States. Just a reminder of who our guests are this evening. In London, Jan Randolph is the Director of Sovereign Risk Analysis at IHS Global Insight. Here in the studio, Susan George is Honorary President of the organisation ATTAC. She also wrote the book, Their Crises Are Solutions. Ali Fatimi is Professor of Finance here at the American Graduate School of Economics in Paris. And also joining us now on the line is George Magnus. He's a Senior Policy Advisor to the bank UBS. George, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Now, you've been quoted as saying that you don't see a single big economy at the moment working to promote growth. What do you think governments should be doing at this stage?
Well, if I could just, first of all, good evening. First of all, I think the issue is that since the big policy stimulus measures that a lot of countries took when the financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, of course, for one reason or another, either under duress or voluntarily, pretty much all of the Western countries have now decided that austerity is the only thing that's acceptable. And the issue that I have is not that some countries shouldn't do it. I mean, we all need to have plans to bring public debt and public deficits under control. And some countries like Greece and Ireland and Portugal, of course, have no choice now because they've lost access to private markets. But for those countries that don't have an imminent debt crisis, and that includes countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, for example, I think there are strong reasons why they should still be able to use changes in tax policy and in infrastructure investment financing, for example, to be able to try to help growth, because no country ever empirically got out of a debt crisis through austerity alone. It can only be done in the context of employment creation and growth.
And this is a point you've made yourself, Susan George, that if we go back to the 1930s and the Depression era, it was all about spending. It was Keynesian economics. And now we're doing the exact opposite.
I've found there's a word in the English language now, or a proper name, that is taboo, and that is Keynes. He knew what he was talking about in the economic consequences of the peace. He said exactly what was going to happen in Germany because Germany was being overtaxed. And when we say that the only policies that is acceptable now, acceptable to whom? Well, to the markets, once more. The markets are now governing. They are saying, you will do this and you will do that. They are in charge of the governments, and the governments are all getting down on their knees to them. And I think that when we say that their money is going to Greece or money is going to Italy or Portugal or wherever, it's not. It is going so that they can pay back our banks. It is just making a circuit.
So it's not money going down a black hole.
No, it isn't money for
recouped.
The people or for improving the economic situation there. It is a circuit. It's a kind of the banks are able to borrow from the ECB at 1%, and they lend on at whatever the traffic will bear. And right now the traffic can bear a great deal, and the banks are making a lot of money.
All right, Ali, and then George.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. First of all, I think the age of Keynes is gone. I think Keynes got credit for Second World War. Governments cannot create growth. Growth comes from the private sector. And the problem basically is that the austerity is not out of choice. Austerity is now being imposed because nobody is willing to lend anymore to governments. That's why they have to choose austerity. The Greeks would have been delighted to continue retiring at 54 and borrowing money and coming up with bigger and bigger debt. As far as growth is concerned, the only way we can have growth is for the consumers to spend more and for private sector to invest more. And those things we cannot do with more taxes. At one point, perhaps during the war, Second World War, that was a possibility. But right now, there is no way. And I also respectfully like to comment on what my colleague here at the studio has said. When you repay the banks, it's not the bankers that get the money. The bankers invest in mine and your pension fund. They invest in buildings, they invest in things. And also the banks have shares which are owned by pension companies. They're owned by individuals. No longer we are talking about Carnegies and Rockefellers and so forth and so on. If you look at the investment of the banks, look at their portfolios, you realize that banks are just like any other corporation in business to make money. I'm not defending some reckless acts that some certain bankers have done, but we cannot condemn the banks as a whole. They're an important instrument for a private economy, and we can't actually go back to Soviet system or to a system where government does everything.
Please don't start pinning the Soviet Union on me. I have never been in favor of any form of state socialism, and I've got plenty of record to show that. But I'm afraid that on the question of public spending, it is a statistical fact that public spending is responsible directly or indirectly for about 2/3 of all the jobs. And that is the source, whether they're employed because they have a government contract to do something or employed directly as a civil servant, those people then have money to spend. I agree with you that it is that consumer spending, and it is a lot of the private sector that's going
Let's
to
see what
create
George,
growth.
because George works for a bank. George is at UBS. What are your thoughts on that, George?
Yeah, well, this is a little bit of muddled thinking going on here, which I think explains why we're in such a mess. So the first thing to understand is we are in the middle, or at the beginning, I would say, of what I have called the great deleveraging. The big, 30-year credit boom that came to an end two or 3 years ago is giving rise, obviously, to a very, very difficult process of debt reduction. We have to destroy it or restructure it in somehow. So it's not markets that are basically demanding policies of austerity. It's politicians that are doing it. So whether it's, creditor countries like Germany that demand austerity from... I'm not saying it's wrong. You have to have... if you cut your cloth according to, to what you can do. And, of course, in a lot of countries, public debt was allowed to expand too quickly. So the politicians are responsible for this. Just look at the debacle that happened in the United States a couple of weeks ago. This is not a market demanding, public spending reduction. This is the capitulation to fringe politics. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's a delusion to think, really, that the private sector can deliver growth in current conditions when it's trying to deleverage. The household sector has got too much debt, the banks have got too much debt, the governments have got too much debt, and companies that have cash basically won't spend because they don't feel confident about the future or the policy environment. So you cannot get out of this without having some... I'm not saying that governments need to spend billions and billions of euros or dollars, but government needs to provide the environment through tax reform, through changes in tax codes, through the provision of funds somehow with the private sector to the companies that do create jobs. Governments don't create most of the jobs. Small and medium-sized enterprises account for about 60% of employment creation. So, this is. I don't believe that. The age of Keynes, if it is dead, it's because governments have basically turned their back on him. But is he relevant today? I would say more than ever.
But is there not a problem, George, on today's markets that they are extremely volatile and there is a lot of complicated financial instruments as well, and investors are leaping from one thing to another, and the whole thing has become very uncertain and very unstable, and that there perhaps does need to be some kind of supervision over how the markets now function?
Yeah, this is what politicians say all the time when things don't go according to plan, is that it's speculators. Berlusconi was talking originally before the Italian fiscal plans were announced about speculators causing the problem with Italy. Yes, if you want to look at it through very, very narrow focus, when people get frightened, they sell things that they believe will go down in value, and they basically cause these kinds of problems. But actually, the reason that we have a default crisis in Europe, or part of the reason, stems from the policies which are followed by the European Central Bank, or have been, until a change of heart yesterday, and also from a failure of political leadership. Europe's ability to manage the debt crisis since Greece got into trouble at the end of 2009 actually has been pretty abysmal, I think.
I wish we wouldn't confuse the European economic problems with the U.S. They're of two different natures. In the U.S., you have a problem of debt, a problem of political leadership, both in Congress and the White House. U.S. is not bankrupt. Europe is quite a different story. In Europe, the only solution, in my opinion, is in the hands of the governments. They have to come up with euro bonds when everyone endorses it and it belongs to all the 17 countries. Of course, the interest rates will go up a little bit higher, and eventually they have to have common fiscal policy.
And Eurobonds, just to explain, would be making European debt a European debt rather than country by country.
And all the new bonds that are issued will have the backing of every country. So to confuse this, it so happens by coincidence that the US and Europe at the same time have crises. They are related, but the solutions are totally different.
What are your thoughts on the idea of euro bonds, making it everybody's problem in Europe and not one country or another?
Well, I don't think we have to go that far. What has to happen is the ECB's got to convince the markets that it is the true lender of last resort. No, it's got to say to the markets, basically, we will buy unlimited amounts of Spanish and Italian bonds if necessary. If you're uncertain about long-term payout for sovereign bond, it is the central bank to provide the euros. The ECB can provide unlimited amounts of euros to pay back on those long-term bonds, whatever happens to the value of the euro in the meantime. It's not there yet. It's not convinced it. The reason why people still stick with 10-year bonds for the UK and the US is because they know the central banks there will provide the pounds and the dollars. But that's not the case with the euro. The ECB has to demonstrate true lender of last resort function.
Yeah, but remember,
to be fair,
the function of the European Central Bank is not to take care of the government debts. European Central Bank, by Maastricht Treaty, has one function, and that is to maintain the value of the euro. And once it starts spending this way, already they are close to $1 trillion. They have to buy 600 billion a year worth of Italian bonds alone. And if they do that, people lose confidence in euro.
Well, once markets are convinced that the ECB will supply unlimited amounts of euros, half the debt crisis will go away. You know, it's an insurance mechanism, and they haven't got it in the Eurozone. It's a bit like Spain and Italy still borrowing in foreign currencies. They should be borrowing, they're not borrowing in foreign currencies, they're borrowing in euros, and the ECB should support the euro for that purpose. And I agree, the ECB can't do everything. Governments, particularly in southern Europe, have to look to Ireland and the Baltics to see how austerity can work with growth. Estonia is now the fastest growing economy in Europe. It did austerity.
Has no debt at all.
And it had very high private debt. If you want to look on both sides, not public and the private side. What they did is an external adjustment, and they used their competitiveness. Arguably, they had much lower costs than the southern Eurozone. But look at Ireland. Ireland's still got high costs. They've got an external surplus. They're an open, flexible economy. They can demonstrate that you can grow out the debt problem through an external adjustment. They're running a current-account surplus despite the heavy debts from the private side.
George Magnus, if I could just
275% of GDP. That is absolute nonsense.
I just wanted to ask George just a point about European institutions. Are they equipped to deal with this crisis, or do they need some serious reform?
Well, they're gradually in the process of being re-equipped, I would say. To be fair, I'm quite critical of Trichet, but I think the ECB has a point which says, which is fair, which is, we are actually not responsible for fiscal functions, and I think that's right. The ECB's function should be to be a lender of last resort in emergency, but not to provide open-ended access in the form of unlimited or large-scale bond purchases. That should be the job of the European Financial Stability Facility once parliamentary approval is agreed, but of course it's already quite late. They should have done it a long time ago. And of course at 440 billion euros it's woefully inadequate. So the next stage is for this to be increased. But I would say I agree with the panelist actually that talked about e-bonds, about European bonds. This will be the next stage of inching towards a level of European integration. I don't know how far this integration will go, because obviously citizens have huge problems with this, and the issue of sovereignty.
Right, the Germans ruled it out. The Germans have ruled it out already.
Well, they have ruled it out, and they are very unacceptable. They're very resistant to it, but they will change.
One at a time, please, Jan.
Throughout the crisis, because creditors have an important role to play in solving this crisis. We all know that debtors that misbehave and that have run that have either cheated with their books or that they have run irresponsible budgetary policies, we all know they have to pay a price. The price is that they have to cut their cloth. But actually, creditors have a big role to play here too, because the burden of debt is so big. and Germany has strong vested interests in this. So, I think that e-bonds are coming, but it'll be, it'll be a torturous process, but I think they will come.
We
Susan.
already have them.
Yes, well, e-bonds.
They're being used to finance the European Financial Stability Fund. They're already being issued.
Not enough.
Yes, they
Susan.
are being issued, but e-bonds are one of the solutions. A larger budget in Europe is another one. But can we go back to the great deleveraging? If it weren't for the banks, we would have not allowed that level of leverage. The banks in the United States spent $5 billion getting every single rule that kept them from doing that sort of thing removed, including the Glass-Steagall Act, which had separated commercial banks from investment banks. And then they went whole hog, and the ratings agencies went along with it, and the governments have paid them back with absolutely no conditions and told the people, you are going to pay. And now they're doing it again. And so this is simply the great injustice of this great deleveraging. Perhaps Americans borrowed too much too, but the banks have got away with absolute murder.
So the banks should take a hit
and
now.
the banks should really take a very large haircut.
Can I just make
Well, I
it?
think that's widely agreed now, isn't it? That actually private sector involvement in the form of losses borne by banks actually will be part of the new environment.
For
I
a
don't
very
think there's any question
small
about
amount.
that.
Can
For
I
a
just
very
make-
relatively
Well, yes, I know,
small
but the
amount.
point
I
is
guess
that
all the microphones are
for
open.
Europeans,
People are
it's a
talking
change,
without paying attention.
something that wasn't even considered before the Germans raised it several months ago. And although there has been one small step in the direction of voluntary restructuring or haircuts, this is just a step towards the next stage, which will be coercive, and the haircuts will be bigger. I don't think there's any question about that, and I think everybody expects
I
it to
hope
happen.
you're right. You're the banker. I'm not. I hope
Let
you're
me-
right.
Well,
Let
I'm
me
telling
just-
you that I think this is what is widely expected.
Let me say
Ali.
just one thing. European politicians have always avoided what is to be done at the certain right time. They have said no, and later on, when it's too late, they have come and they have done that. And now with this Eurobond, and also a common fiscal policy, if they don't move in that direction, they're going to get there 6 months or a year from now, where many, many people lose their jobs, many families are destroyed, many plans are totally out of whack, and then the Europeans come and they do something which they should have done 6 months ago. And I think that's the problem. If there is any failure, it's lack of leadership in Europe. If you had today Schmidt or Kohl or Mitterrand or people like that or Delors who made Europe, I think they would have enough courage to take the right step at the right time instead of always being behind the clock.
Do we need a new generation of European leaders? I mean, these are leaders who have been in power for a long time now, isn't it? Berlusconi, Zapatero, Sarkozy, Merkel. They've all been, with the exception of David Cameron in the UK, they have all been in power for a long time. Are we out of ideas? We need some fresh ideas.
Well, we certainly do, and I think that it's always difficult, because I think you could look at a lot of countries and say that, the leaders are not particularly inspiring. But this crisis, which actually started, of course, in 2008, 2009, actually is a once-in-a-generation crisis. I mean, it's a huge problem which is going to take a decade to resolve, if we're lucky. And in a way, it's not surprising. I mean, it's sad to reflect that even President Obama, who came into office with such hope, has not actually kind of stepped up to the proverbial plate to lead the United States out of its crisis. But here in Europe, I think it's a terrible part of the situation that we've been basically struggling. Nobody's really been able to grab the crisis by the scruff of the neck and actually provide a comprehensive program to lead us out of it. But I'm hopeful, right? Because 21st of July, there were a series of changes which were announced, which are steps in the right direction. It was too little too late, but hopefully we will get to a place where at least the bond market crisis can be resolved. The Eurozone's existential crisis is another matter for the next 2 or 3 years, and that will require a new generation of leaders, I think.
Deanne Randolph, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'd agree with most of that, actually. I was actually quite encouraged by what happened over the last few days. The central bank, ECB, stepping up, improving its ammunition, its firepower, and also saying, look, if governments like Madrid and Rome reform, if they get a grip of their budget, if they institute growth-enhancing reforms, structural reforms, deregulate, open up their economies, we will support you. As long as the ECB moves in the same direction as Madrid and Rome on the reform front, then it's looking a little bit more hopeful, as far as I'm concerned.
Remember, a new president is coming in. Jean-Claude Trichet is finished, and now we are having Mr. De Graaf, Italy, coming in, and hopefully he will be just as capable a central banker as Trichet has been.
He's an ex-IMF man, so he will toe the line and he will be extremely orthodox. But I just would like to repeat that growth is an illusion so long as we are pushing people into unemployment. Spain's unemployment is 20%. And for good reason, people are protesting. There have been, so far they have all been nonviolent, and I think the indignados in Spain have understood that that's the only way to go, is through nonviolence. But we have to put pressure on our governments to just say enough is enough, because it's the total injustice of the situation is visible to everyone. Believe me, I'm not in a bank milieu, and I talk to people outside of this milieu, and it is so clear to everyone now that they are having to pay for the mistakes of others. It's a moral crisis as well, where you reward the guilty and you punish the innocent, and this is unfortunately what is happening.
So what's the answer then? More supervision of the financial sector, more regulation?
To put back a lot more regulation. It is to rescind everything the banks got over about 15 years of deregulation. It is making public companies out of some that have been privatized, certainly not all.
So reversing privatization.
But reversing and stopping it in any case. I would have said, if I were the Greek government, we're going to have a moratorium on the debt. You will get paid back, but first we are going to do an audit of what is legitimate and what is illegitimate debt. There's a legal concept called odious debt, which means that debt was taken and robbed the people, not used to invest and so on, by dictators and so on. And you can do that. It's not irresponsible.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, Susan. We're going to have to hold it there. President Obama is just speaking in Washington, so we're going to cross over to that to hear what he has to say right now.
We learned that the United States received a downgrade by one of the credit rating agencies. Not so much because they doubt our ability to pay our debt if we make good decisions, but because after witnessing a month of wrangling over raising the debt ceiling, they doubted our political system's ability to act. The markets, on the other hand, continue to believe our credit status is AAA. In fact, Warren Buffett, who knows a thing or two about good investments, said, if there were a quadruple A rating, I'd give the United States that. I and most of the world's investors agree. That doesn't mean we don't have a problem. The fact is, we didn't need a rating agency to tell us that we need a balanced, long-term approach to deficit reduction. That was true last week. That was true last year. That was true the day I took office. And we didn't need a rating agency to tell us that the gridlock in Washington over the last several months has not been constructive, to say the least. We knew from the outset that a prolonged debate over the debt ceiling, a debate where the threat of default was used as a bargaining chip, could do enormous damage to our economy and the world's. That threat, coming after a string of economic disruptions in Europe, Japan, and the Middle East, has now roiled the markets and dampened consumer confidence and slowed the pace of recovery. So all of this is a legitimate source of concern. But here's the good news. Our problems are imminently solvable, and we know what we have to do to solve them. With respect to debt, our problem is not confidence in our credit. The markets continue to reaffirm our credit as among the world's safest. Our challenge is the need to tackle our deficits over the long term. Last week, we reached an agreement that will make historic cuts to defense and domestic spending. But there's not much further we can cut in either of those categories. What we need to do now is combine those spending cuts with two additional steps. Tax reform that will ask those who can afford it to pay their fair share, and modest adjustments to healthcare programs like Medicare. Making these reforms doesn't require any radical steps. What it does require is common sense and compromise. There are plenty of good ideas about how to achieve long-term deficit reduction that doesn't hamper economic growth right now. Republicans and Democrats on the bipartisan fiscal commission that I set up put forth good proposals. Republicans and Democrats in the Senate's Gang of Six came up with some good proposals. John Boehner and I came up with some good proposals when we came close to agreeing on a grand bargain. So it's not a lack of plans or policies that's the problem here. It's a lack of political will in Washington. It's the insistence on drawing lines in the sand, a refusal to put what's best for the country ahead of self-interest or party or ideology. And that's what we need to change. I realize that after what we just went through, there's some skepticism that Republicans and Democrats on the so-called super committee, this joint committee that's been set up, will be able to reach a compromise. But my hope is that Friday's news will give us a renewed sense of urgency. I intend to present my own recommendations over the coming weeks on how we should proceed. And that committee will have this administration's full cooperation. And I assure you, we will stay on it until we get the job done. Of course, as worrisome as the issues of debt and deficits may be, the most immediate concern of most Americans, and of concern to the marketplace as well, is the issue of jobs and the slow pace of recovery coming out of the worst recession in our lifetimes. And the good news here is that by coming together to deal with the long-term debt challenge, we would have more room to implement key proposals that can get the economy to grow faster. Specifically, we should extend the payroll tax cut as soon as possible so that workers have more money in their paychecks next year and businesses have more customers next year. We should continue to make sure that if you're one of the millions of Americans who's out there looking for a job, you can get the unemployment insurance that your tax dollars contributed to. That will also put money in people's pockets and more customers in stores. In fact, if Congress fails to extend the payroll tax cut and the unemployment insurance benefits that I've called for, it could mean 1 million fewer jobs and 0.5% less growth. This is something we can do immediately, something we can do as soon as Congress gets back. We should also help companies that want to repair our roads and bridges and airports so that thousands of construction workers who've been without a job for the last few years can get a paycheck again. That will also help to spur economic growth. These aren't democratic proposals. These aren't big government proposals. These are all ideas that traditionally Republicans have agreed to countless times in the past. There's no reason we shouldn't act on them now. None. I know we're going through a tough time right now. We've been going through a tough time for the last 2.5 years. I know a lot of people are worried about the future, but here's what I also know. There will always be economic factors that we can't control. Earthquakes, spikes in oil prices, slowdowns in other parts of the world. But how we respond to those tests, that's entirely up to us. Markets will rise and fall, but this is the United States of America. No matter what some agency may say, we've always been and always will be a AAA country. For all of the challenges we face, we continue to have the best universities, some of the most productive workers, the most innovative companies, the most adventurous entrepreneurs on earth. And what sets us apart is that we've always not just had the capacity, but also the will to act, the determination to shape our future, the willingness in our democracy to work out our differences in a sensible way, and to move forward, not just for this generation, but for the next generation. And we're going to need to summon that spirit today. The American people have been through so much over the last few years, dealing with the worst recession, the biggest financial crisis since the 1930s. And they've done it with grace. And they're working so hard to raise their families. And all they ask is that we work just as hard here in this town to make their lives a little bit easier. And that's not too much to ask. And ultimately, the reason I am so hopeful about our future, the reason I have faith in these United States of America is because of the American people. It's because of their perseverance and their courage and their willingness to shoulder the burdens we face together as one nation. One last thing. There is no one who embodies the qualities I mentioned more than the men and women of the United States Armed Forces. And this weekend, we lost 30 of them when their helicopter crashed during a mission in Afghanistan. And their loss is a stark reminder of the risks that our men and women in uniform take every single day on behalf of their country. Day after day, night after night, they carry out missions like this in the face of enemy fire and grave danger. And in this mission, as in so many others, they were also joined by Afghan troops, 7 of whom lost their lives as well. So I've spoken to our generals in the field, as well as President Karzai, and I know that our troops will continue the hard work of transitioning to a stronger Afghan government and ensuring that Afghanistan is not a safe haven for terrorists. We will press on and we will succeed.
All right then, so the US President Barack Obama there speaking in Washington live, seeking to reassure over that S&P downgrade which happened at the weekend, but also seeking to reassure over the wider economy there. He's talking a lot about having a hard time now, but we've been having a hard time for the past 2.5 years, he says, Ali Fatimi. But he did come up with some initiatives there, didn't he? Tax reform, top of his list.
Absolutely. I think he's brilliant. I think the timing was perfect. He is going to take the stage and become a leader, the kind like Franklin Roosevelt, who in the depths of depression said to the Americans, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. This was that kind of a speech, and I think the phrase that will remain is, America will always be a AAA country. That is his message, and I hope beyond this point he continues this way of going ahead. My colleague here earlier said, things must change, we must do this and so on. We can only do that in a democracy if we have the people to vote the right way. In the last election, people didn't vote the right way. It is the president who has to change the public opinion. America is a democracy. Government can only do what people vote for. And if he continues this, hopefully in the next election, he will get the kind of Congress that will allow him the last 2 years of his presidency and the future term.
Right, okay. But with all due respect to the president, it's all very well making a pretty speech, as it were, in Washington tonight. But actually, tax reform is something that the Tea Party and the Republicans are extremely opposed to. So he might not be able to do what he says he's going to do.
If he succeeds in turning around the public opinion, I think the Tea Party, after all, want to get re-elected. They won't go this far. But in the last 2 years, in the last election, he lost the people. He came in with tremendous public support. Somehow they got the initiative. He has to get it back. He has to show that what it has done to the United States, what it will do to U.S. worldwide. And I think if he continues on this kind of a speech, he will succeed.
All right, Ali Fatimi, many thanks. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. Susan George, thank you to you. Jan Randolph in London, Georges Rouget in New York, and of course George Magnus from UBS, also in the UK. Thank you very much indeed to you all. And thanks to my guests, and thanks to you for watching. We're going to hand you over now to the newsroom for the latest international headlines. Over to you.
A hero to many, in Malaysia, the Philippines and Indonesia, Osama bin Laden is being mourned. All over Southeast Asia, Islamic activists are swearing vengeance. As the Islamic holy war spreads worldwide, they're taking up the baton from the first generation of Asian jihadists, many of whom are now in jail. From the jungles of the Philippines to the jails of Indonesia, France 24 followed the trail of Al-Qaeda's Asian network to Abbottabad in Pakistan, where bin Laden was killed. Some of them agreed to be interviewed for the first time. Don't miss this exclusive report, Thursday, 9:45 p.m. Paris time on France 24.